New research shows that most people are naturally resilient and find ways to adjust and move forward while grief is real and painful. It doesn't have to mean endless suffering.
The trajectories are really how people function over time. Coping with the death of another person can be an existential challenge. Our brains want to know what reality is and want to be able to predict what will happen next.
Many people naturally recover from trauma
Yeah.
without lasting psychological or social harm. Is therapy always necessary after trauma?
The number of people who suffer prolonged grief symptoms is less than 10%. Social media is not inherently bad. It's not inherently evil. Follow trusted news sources for a little bit during the day, know what's going on, and then stop thinking about it.
In each episode, we dwell into the realms of wellness, exploring the latest trends, expert advice, and practical tips to help lead you a happy, healthier life. We aim to bring a broader perspective to our American audience on issues that impact your daily life by interviewing guests from the US and around the world. From nutrition and fitness to mental well-being and beyond, we're here to empower you with knowledge and inspiration. So whether you're looking to boost your energy, revamp your diet, or simply trying to find a balance in your lifestyle, you're at the right place. Join us as we embark on a journey towards a better, brighter you. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Khan, and together let's unlock the secrets to living life to its fullest. Losing someone we loved is one of the hardest experiences in life, and yet for years, we've been told grief follows a set of pattern of painful stages. Many believe that deep sadness lasts for years and that healing will happen with time, but it's sometimes a slow, difficult process. But what if it's not true? New research shows that most people are naturally resilient and find ways to adjust and move forward sooner than once what we thought. While grief is real and painful, it doesn't have to mean endless suffering. Many people adapt in their own way, finding strength and even moments of peace along the way. Grief isn't the same for everyone. Instead of following strict rules, our emotions change based on how we cope, the support system we have, and the way we process loss. While some struggle longer, many are able to recover without even realizing their own resilience. This new understanding challenges the old beliefs about grief and offers hope that healing is possible and can be done faster, even if the loss is great. Today, we explore the science of resilience, how people naturally adjust to grief, and why our minds and hearts are stronger than we think. Welcome to Khan Clinics. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Khan. Our guest today is Dr. George Bonanno. Dr. George Bonanno is a renowned clinical psychologist, researcher, and professor at Columbia's University Teachers College, runs the Loss, Trauma, and Emotion Lab, widely recognized for its groundbreaking work on trauma, grief, and resilience. Dr. George holds a PhD in clinical psychology from Yale University. He's introduced several concepts, but one of them, the resilience trajectory, highlights the diverse way how people cope with adversity. His research challenges the traditional views on grief, debunking the widely accepted stages of grief model, and emphasizes emotional flexibility as a key factor in psychological well-being. He's also authored 3 influential books, including the end of trauma and the other side of sadness and emotions, current issues, and future direction. Beyond grief and trauma, Dr. Bonanno's research explores emotional regulation, coping with stress, and human adaptability. He has been constantly ranked amongst the 1% of the most cited worldwide scientists, reinforcing his impact across scientific disciplines. Dr. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you for having me.
We're going to be unlocking the secrets of resilience, Dr. George. We're going to try to discover today how people overcome grief, trauma, and life's toughest moments with strength. And you mentioned emotional flexibility. Let's start off with the idea of resilience trajectory. Can
Yeah.
you explain to our audience what it means and how it helps us understand how people adapt to tough times?
Sure. Well, the trajectories are really how people function over time, what their mental health is like over time, and this came about when I first began to study bereavement, grieving, which at that time pretty much everything was conceptualized in what I call a binary model. Either people had psychopathology, prolonged grief or PTSD or something like that, or not. And what we found when we began to actually look, this is the real thing, the real contribution of this research at the time, is we simply got lots of people who had gone through the event. So we began with grief and bereavement. So we recruited a lot of people who had recently lost a spouse, the death of a spouse, and followed them over time. And we found there were different patterns. It wasn't just pathology or not psychopathology. It wasn't binary. We found there were different trajectories. And what we found was that there was a trajectory of people who basically continued to show stable, good mental health, despite having gone through a loss, and later, despite having gone through a traumatic event. And we called that the resilience trajectory. And it turned out that was the most common pattern we saw. It was often the majority of people. They basically, people hurt when they lose a loved one. There's pain and there is sadness, but they basically were able to keep functioning. They were able to continue to live healthy and lives filled with joy. So, health is being able to connect with other people, concentrate and work and be able to experience moments of joy. And that's what we saw. Most people could still do that.
A resilience trajectory, and your research is showing that sides of sadness, you've challenged that traditional 5 stages of grief model. Would you explain what are first the 5 stages, the normal 5 stages of grief, and how is your work different or explains a different trajectory?
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't even think I can name you the 5 stages of grief because I cannot remember them. The main argument here is that the stages of grief were actually originally proposed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross as a way to understand what people go through when they're facing their own death. They were the stages of dying, basically. And she had hypothesized these stages based on what she saw in people she was working with who were facing death. And they seemed reasonable. They seemed to make sense. But then at one point, those stages kind of got applied to bereavement. And it was considered then the stages that people go through when they're trying to come to terms with the death of somebody else. The problem is, well, the advantage of these stages is people like them because coping with loss, coping with the death of another person can be an existential challenge because it raises this question, I was close to this person. This person is in my life, they're in my mind. When they're not with me, I still think of them, and now they no longer exist. Where did they go? What is life and death? What happened there? These are big questions, and it's confusing and painful for people. So the 5 stages of grief told people very clearly, this is what you can expect, these 5 stages. And that, to some people, was comforting, the idea that there's a roadmap in a sense. The problem is, there is really no empirical evidence for these stages. They've never actually been shown scientifically to have any validity. And many people who didn't experience these stages began to feel like there's something wrong with them. They're not doing grief the right way because they're not experiencing these stages. And in my own research now, which is going on for almost 30 years, with I don't know how many people, well over thousands of people that we've looked at in our research studies, we've never seen anything like these stages. Instead, what we see is that most people are very upset. Most people become very distressed by the death of a loved one. They're confused, struggling. Their minds are struggling to make sense of it, and they gradually somehow pull out of that. They gradually begin to accept, okay, that this person is no longer physically there. And there isn't a stage that happens. It's a kind of a process that gradually fades away for most people.
Thank you for explaining that. Should have rephrased the question: denial, anger, bargaining, then depression, and acceptance. Is one of the stages, or one of the, like you mentioned, Kobler-Ross is research showing, but your work was different, and you've explained that the stages may not occur in that flow. They may be different. Is that right? And that you may experience some parts and you may not experience others.
I think many people don't experience any of those so-called stages. Stages don't appear to actually exist. People are confused. They're deeply sad. Many people realize, okay, death is serious, and this person in my life has gone. But the mind, it's our brains are prediction machines. Our brains want to know what reality is and want to be able to predict what will happen next. And our brains, I think, go through a process of trying to recalibrate life without this person in the world. They're still in our minds, when we love somebody or when we're attached to somebody. When they're not present, we still think of them. We know that they still exist. We still imagine the world with them in it, and we think of perhaps things we want to tell them next time we see them. When a person dies, we still imagine that person in the world. We still can imagine telling them things or seeing them again, but we now know, we have this fact, they are actually no longer living, and our brains have this task of kind of recreating the world, recalibrating the world in a different way. This person is no longer physically present. And that's very confusing for people, I think. And it, as I said, it raises existential questions, but it just basically takes time. People have these almost hallucinatory experiences. They're, say, sitting in their house and they hear a car and they think, oh, my husband is home, or my son is back, or my friend is calling, or sometimes they see a person in public and they think they saw the person that they lost. And that's simply the brain, assuming the person is still there. And it takes a little bit of time for that to for us to slowly acclimate. And I think that's what the process of grieving is. That's what sadness does. Sadness as the emotion helps us deal with that. Most people are able to do this relatively quickly, within a couple of weeks or so, where they realize, okay, the person is gone and I'm just having to go on without that person. And it's painful, but they're able to do it.
So acceptance. Dr. Bonanno, you've mentioned the experience of positive emotions.
Yes.
And you've talked about laughter during times of stress or grief. Would you explain to our audience, how does it help overcoming grief?
Well, laughter is remarkably common. Happiness and laughter are remarkably common during bereavement. And they're very social, they're bonding emotions. We tend to think of emotions as being continuous. So say a person is a process of grieving, and they may be grieving or they be feeling upset for, say, a month or 2 months. And during that time, it may seem like they're sad the entire time, but that's not actually possible. Emotions come and go. They kind of oscillate. So our minds tend to interpret that as we're constantly sad, but there are definitely periods where emotions come and go. We feel sad, then we kind of forget for a little while. And in those oscillations, people are capable of actually feeling quite happy or joyful in times, mostly because their mind is kind of temporarily forgetting that they're sad. Smiling and laughter are bonding emotions with other people. We have an apparatus, our facial expressions, which show other people that we're sad. and which is, I think, a marvel of nature. It's a marvel of evolution. When we feel sad, we show a sad face, and that tells other people that we are feeling lost, and we are turned inward, because when we're sad, we turn inward. We stop paying attention to the world so much around us, and other people respond to those sad faces with the desire to take care of us, with sympathy. There's good research showing this. So when we're sad, other people are reaching out to us, and many cultures have bereavement rituals where other people close to the person will take care of the bereaved person, have a bring food, or visit them and make sure they're okay. And as all this is going on, we also then are capable of sharing brief bits of joy with other people, maybe a smile or a story. And we see this in all the research we've done. We see this constantly in the videos of people spontaneously laughing, even though moments ago they were crying. And it's a way of kind of reaching out and connecting back with the people that are taking care of us, with other people. And it's quite common. And most people, I think, don't realize this. But when we have videotaped people that we interview, we see this in these videotapes very clearly.
Excellent. And thank you for explaining that. Probably just hit the nail on the coffin, how you explained why bereavement in cultures and bringing food can be a tradition, and yet, or describing a story of a loved one who you were just bereaving about, and how it can bring laughter and all of a sudden alleviate that tension or anxiety. So yeah, no, that's absolutely resonates and clicks. And thanks for explaining. You mentioned in your research many people naturally recover from trauma without lasting psychological or social harm. Is therapy always necessary after trauma?
No, absolutely not. No, therapy is, after grief or trauma, therapy is absolutely not always necessary. There are actually a very small number of people who really need, I say, professional help. And then there are some people who maybe would like professional help. There's no shortage of, if we look at the numbers, the percentages, the number of people who suffer prolonged grief symptoms is less than 10%. But if you think about it, the number of people that everybody loses a loved one, or many loved ones, during the course of their lives. So 1 out of every 10 of those people is still a lot of people who would, seek professional help. I think the assumptions several decades ago, when I first began my research, were that everybody would need help with grief, with bereavement, but that's simply not the case. And in fact, if they do seek help, it's usually not effective because they really don't need the help, and could possibly even make people worse by getting them to ruminate on something that they didn't need to ruminate on. But when people need help, it's usually very clear. They're really struggling. They're not functioning in their life. And then professional help can be really useful.
Excellent. Very, very nice. You touched upon is that don't ruminate, probably accept, cope with it positively, and then move on. You also discussed the concept of coping ugly. Can you elaborate on that? How does it relate to resilience?
Yeah, so coping ugly, it's the idea that when we look at actually the way people cope, the way they regulate emotions, we don't find there's another kind of a myth that there are some very adaptive ways to cope, and then some maladaptive ways to cope. And the research that I've been doing, and some other people, on what we call regulation flexibility, or emotion regulation flexibility, whatever we want to call it. I call it regulatory flexibility. That research shows us that lots of different behaviors can be useful. Lots of different coping habits can be useful depending on the situation. And what we think is very adaptive is actually sometimes not adaptive in some situations, because the challenges we face in different situations are very different. So at any given time, we have to kind of decide what's the best way for me to deal with this, to keep myself on track here. What is the best way for me to manage myself? Coping ugly, the idea is that in some situations, at certain points in time, behaviors that we don't think of as normally adaptive, or sometimes even behaviors we wouldn't even think of using or as healthy, can be very adaptive in that moment. We just simply need to get past that moment, and whatever it takes to get past that moment is probably adaptive. If we did it all the time, it's not adaptive, but it's very adaptive in that moment.
Could you give an example?
Sure. Well, it's very idiosyncratic. It depends on each person, but examples might be common. Example might be, having a lot to drink in one moment, or binge shopping, or making an impulsive decision to do something, or going off when one shouldn't, or not going into work one day, or doing any sort of thing like that, taking the day off and going to a movie, or anything like that that one normally wouldn't do, but it might be what someone needs just at that moment. I just need to get through that moment and I'll be okay, or it just helps us, give us a little bit of a break for that time. And sometimes that's very adaptive. Most of the things I mentioned would not be very effective if we did them all the time, but just in certain moments they can be very adaptive. And that's why I use the phrase coping ugly. It's not pretty. It's not a stellar way to cope, but in that moment it did the job, and so it's okay. It's good to do that.
What advice would you give, or your research shows? Yes, it is okay to pass that moment, but you want to prevent from relapsing back into those thoughts. How would you suggest one copes in those circumstances?
If somebody is having kind of ruminating on some difficult things, well, then the task becomes to set that. It's always important to think about what it is that's bothering me, or what it is that I need to address. So if it's I can't stop thinking about something, then we try to find strategies in the moment, and then in the next moment, etc. So, okay, maybe I need to distract myself right now. That's not going to work all the time. But then if I'm still thinking about something that is really bothering, maybe we decide, okay, let me try to talk with somebody I trust. Let me try to read about this and see if there's help there. Or maybe I need to, get out and be out into the world. People call this behavioral activation sometimes. I just need to get out. I'm in my home and I'm thinking all the time about this, and it's making me very unhappy. I need to get outside and be with other people, or call a friend, or, just get a new activity. But we can decide, one moment at a time. When we first articulate for ourselves what it is that's bothering us, is the first step is to decide what's bothering us, and then we can think of different possible solutions and try them out. And that's really, it's very idiosyncratic. It depends on each person and each moment in time. They can try different things.
You've mentioned focusing too much on loss can prolong grief. Can you discuss briefly the balance between acknowledging loss and then fostering resilience?
Well, sure. I think that people have a need to talk about a loss, to share it with other people, and to think about the person they lost. As I said, I think a lot of that has to do with us coming to terms with the fact that the person is gone, accepting their death, and accepting the fact that they no longer live in the world we live in. We can still think of people. We can still feel bonded with them in a way, even though we accept that they're gone. We can still value their lives, but we can only, to a certain extent, that's all we can do. And at that point, we have to really then focus on moving forward in our lives. So at some point, if we're not moving forward in our lives, then this balance is interrupted. It's not a healthy balance, and we have to do something to try to set that straight.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. We're just going to move on to another topic, and that's social media lifestyles that are out there. Dr. Bonanno, tell us, what do you think that has impacted one's ability on resilience? Is there, and what advice do you give for people struggling with stress, loss, or major life transitions today in a life of social media influences?
I think that, there's a lot of controversy about social media, especially in young people. I think that what the research that I'm aware of seems to show is that social media is not inherently bad. It's not inherently evil. It's entertaining. It can be useful, because with social media, we also connect with lots of other people. And there's a certain social capital that happens with that. which so I think and that can be adaptive. I think we see when people are struggling, when they're emotionally and psychologically struggling, then social media use seems to become maladaptive. Then it seems to become more of a burden than an aid. And I think we're still at a point in our history as human beings. This is still a new thing. Social media, in fact, media in general, because it's available 24 hours a day. And we have to, I think, pay attention to our reactions to social media and our use of social media. And we can make ourselves crazy very easily by looking all the time at the latest updates in a story in the news or in how other people are reacting to us. And it's important, I think, to titrate this for ourselves, to decide to look at it sometimes and not restrict it completely, but also to be mindful of the fact that we might be looking at social media or media in general far too often, and that becomes very maladaptive. And that's really a decision people have to make for themselves. But I think it's very important for people to think about that the frequency with which they engage in it too often, and it becomes, I think, more problematic.
Thank you for explaining that. Dr. Joe, you discussed the importance of emotional flexibility in dealing with trauma. How does emotional flexibility impact long term mental health? Would you share some practical ways or tips one can develop this skill?
Sure. So one of the things that we've done is we've begun to break it down, this flexibility down into the parts that comprise it. So flexibility isn't one thing. So, when somebody is flexible, we use this as a shorthand, but it's a number of different processes are involved. One of them we call context sensitivity. It's where we ask ourselves the question, what is happening right now? Like, what is it that's bothering me? And sometimes, we're feeling bad and we don't even quite realize it. A loved one might say, "Are you okay?" And then at that point, a person might realize, "Yeah, I'm feeling kind of agitated now, or I'm feeling kind of angry, or I'm not myself today." But the first step is to really just pay attention to our bodies and the information we have, and identify that there is something that we're unhappy about, or something that's stressful for us. And when we do that, then we focus on that. That's the first step, what I call context sensitivity. Then the second step is where we decide to do something about that, to try to address that feeling. We use a strategy, but here we call this repertoire, because it's not just using a strategy, it's using a strategy from our own repertoire. And this is something that people need to become accustomed to thinking about the repertoire they have. Different people have different strategy repertoires. So if, we tend to hear about, this is the best emotion regulation strategy, this is the best way to cope. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. It's more like each person will have the strategies that they are comfortable using, that they know how to use. And from those strategies, kind of like a toolbox of strategies. Each person has a toolbox of strategies, and they can think about using what do they have in their toolbox that can address this problem. So maybe I'm feeling anxious right now. What do I have in my toolbox that helps me when I'm feeling anxious? I'm not sleeping well. What do I have in my toolbox that might help me when I'm not sleeping? What can I try? And that's the second stage. The third stage that we call feedback is where we actually then monitor the success of whatever we're trying, and we correct it if we need to. And I think this is a very important step, the feedback step, because even the healthiest people don't cope perfectly the first time they try something. Human beings cope by trial and error, and we just guess at what we can do. So say I'm feeling anxious, I think about the strategies I have that I've used in the past. I'll try one of those strategies. Did it help me? If it didn't help me, a lot of people give up at this point. They feel like I just can't cope with this. But in fact, in the feedback stage is when it's really important that we try something else. Then we try something else from our repertoire. And we see if that works, if that helps us. And sometimes that doesn't help us, and we might try another strategy. If that doesn't help us, maybe we think, maybe I'm looking at this problem in a too broad a way. I'll go back to the beginning. and I'll try it again. So for example, someone might say, I'm feeling anxious right now, and I don't know why. So in my toolbox, I exercise. This is one of the ways that I keep myself healthy and happy. So I'll exercise. I'll go for a jog, or I'll go to the gym and do something. But I'm still feeling anxious. Okay, that didn't do the job. What else do I have at my disposal? Maybe I'll call a close friend and talk about this with them. And that works better. Now I feel a little bit better. Okay, so now I've got myself back. And this is what the gist of flexibility is. It's this capacity to try different things to adapt to a situation.
Excellent. Dr. Bonanno, we would love to hear what sort of research you're involved in right now, if any, some future directions or
Yes,
what
sure.
that excites you. Please share with our audience. They love to hear.
Yeah, right now I'm spending a lot of my time on this concept of flexibility, and we're trying to get at this in a number of ways. One way we do this with language. We ask people to talk to us about how they're dealing with the stressors in their lives, and we're trying to develop AI models, ways to automatically code the text that will tell us how a person is doing, and how they are doing in terms of flexibility. Are they able to do this? And this is a way, perhaps a teaching tool that we can use then to help people better cope with the world around them, or better cope with the struggles that they're having. We're also developing some training materials to see if we can help better teach people these skills, because these skills, I think, are their basic skills, and they're very important skills. They're skills most people learn during the course of their development as they're growing older. Like beginning with young children, people are taught about flexibility. They're taught to, begin to differentiate situations. You behave one way here and a different way here. You can be loud and having fun in this situation, but in this situation you must be quiet and more well behaved. Children learn this slowly, and as they move towards adulthood, children becoming into adults begin to learn that there are different strategies and different ways of behaving in different situations, and different ways of solving emotional problems. And I think that that's something that we all go through. We all do experience to some level. So we're trying to develop some training right now that articulates all this to help people understand all this, and then build up where they think they might have some deficits.
Dr. Bonanno, would love to hear your final comments or message you would like to give out to our audience.
I think this is a little bit of a philosophical message, perhaps, but I think right now there's a lot of turmoil in the world, and a lot of people are very upset. There's things happening in the Middle East. There are things happening in the U.S. right now. There's things happening in Ukraine. There's a lot of war. There's a lot of political turmoil. There's a lot of confusion, and I think it's very easy right now. It seems, and there's climate change, so it's easier. It seems than in recent years. It's getting easier for people to ruminate on these problems and to worry about them and to talk about them all the time. And I think, as a psychologist and as a researcher on trauma and stress and resilience, I think my advice would be, or my thoughts on that would be, it's important to stay informed and to read the news and keep abreast of what's happening in the world to a certain point. Maybe, follow trusted news sources for a little bit during the day, know what's going on, and then stop thinking about it. Make it a point not to think about these things and focus instead on your own personal mental health and well-being. So it's a combination of those things. Keep abreast of what's happening in the world, just to the point where you know what's happening, and then make sure to take care of yourself and keep yourself healthy and happy. And that's the best thing you can do right now, I think, in a troubled world.
Dr. Bonanno, I want to ask one final question, and maybe I should have asked this earlier. You discuss about the trauma and stresses in the world, and you mentioned how you try to listen to trusted news. There's not a lot that is out there, unfortunately.
Yeah.
What message would you give to kids and those immature adults that are out there that are not coping well with the news stress that they are getting from the world? You mentioned a couple of things. You said, "Oh, stop thinking look after your own well-being, emphasize on your mental. But some of these are kids and they're not able to understand or distinguish when to stop, when to know that this is too much, when is it that this is affecting them. Would you share some signs that would help them say, hey, now I've crossed the limit, I should stop? And just a general message. It's a lot of, like you mentioned, worldly
Yeah.
stresses that are out there.
Yeah. Well, I don't feel that I have full expertise with younger people. I'm not as knowledgeable about the lives of younger people, apart from my own children that I raised. But I think the message I would say is pay attention to your body and your emotions, which are very strong indicators of how you're doing. If something is making you feel anxious and distressed, that's a good sign. Maybe then you need to do something about that. And if being on social media or thinking too much about the world's problems is making you feel anxious and distressed, and it's a signal. Your body's giving you a signal that you need to do something about that. And we are all fairly able to receive these signals from our bodies, and are in our minds, and this sense of being upset, and we know we can also then decide to do something to calm ourselves. We can decide to do something to help ourselves get through, and also to stay focused on the fact that life changes and things run their course. Older people have the advantage of knowing that bad situations don't last forever. The world is constantly changing. And things do run their course eventually. And so I think for younger people to realize that there's lots of time, especially for younger people, and they need to make sure, to pay attention to their own mental health. And if they see signs that things are getting out of hand, do something about that. And that's the best way to be effective in the world, and is to keep yourself on track.
Brilliant. That's a brilliant advice. That's all the time we have for today, everyone. A very deep discussion with Dr. George. Dr. George, thank you very much for sharing your valuable insight with us. We really appreciate it, and thank you for being on our show today.
My pleasure, Amir. Thanks very much for having me.
And we also want to thank our amazing audience for tuning in to another episode of Khan Clinics. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Feel to drop your comments. We love hearing from you. And meanwhile, from Dr. Khan, have a good evening and stay blessed.